Okay, this week we are going to be talking about language. And deciding where to put language in this course is a real challenge for me because, on the one hand, language is something we study and there's a whole field of anthropology devoted to it. But on the other hand, understanding aspects of language is key to the methods of anthropology, so it's part of our methods. So I'm going to talk about what language is, how we view language, how language shapes our ideas of the world, and how understanding more than just the spoken word is important. And when we think about language, language is a human universal. It is the way we communicate. It's also one of the key ways we learn, share, and pass on culture. So like cultural knowledge, speaking and understanding are quite remarkable capabilities of the human mind. Human language is a unique form of communication in the animal world because it is highly specific and highly flexible. So if you think about a dog's verbal communication, they have a handful of barks: happy, aggressive, let me out, let's play, but they can't be very specific. They can't distinguish I'm barking aggressively at the mailman versus I'm barking aggressively at the neighbor, or I'm barking aggressively at a strange dog. There is just one aggressive bark for all aggressive situations. As a human, my verbal communication is specific. Look, there's that mailman I don't like. He's wearing his stupid baggy blue shorts and showing his skinny, pale, hairy legs with the deep scars on his left shin where the neighbor's dog bit him 3 weeks ago. And I can be flexible. I can say the same thing in more than one way. Look out, there's a snake in the tree. Or if there's a viper in the tree, you should be careful. Human language can do all these things because it is symbolic. It is based on culturally defined meanings given to sounds. We can combine sounds in many, many ways and give them many different meanings. And that's what allows us to be so specific, flexible, and to convey any type of information using language. It is an extraordinarily powerful tool. And when we think about symbols, remember back to some of the characteristics of culture. A symbol is an arbitrary sign that stands for something else. It has no inherent or natural relationship to its referent. The connection is purely by convention or agreement. So we agree culturally that a red octagon means stop, but people in other cultures could never guess that. Words are symbols, so the sound pen has no inherent relationship to the object. We just agree what it means. Symbols are arbitrary and there's no limit on them. You can always invent a new one and assign a meaning to it. So think of some of the new symbols that we have invented in language lately. Things like selfie. That's a symbol that represents taking a picture of yourself with a camera. So it doesn't have any necessary inherent relationship. Language is learned from others, meaning that it's culturally transmitted through a process of social learning rather than being something that each individual invents on his or her own. Walking or throwing may be individually learned through experiment and experience, but language has to be learned from others socially. A language only works if multiple people know it, meaning that it's productive, and when these sounds are produced, these sounds are a means for communication for all who have been taught that particular language. So from one point of view, language is a part of culture, but it's much more than that. It's central to the culture since it's the means through which most of culture is learned and communicated. Only humans have the biological capacity for language. So this allows us to communicate cultural ideas and symbolic meanings from one generation to the next. And in any language, an infinite number of possible sentences can be constructed and used to convey an infinite number of cultural ideas. And this is very different than other kinds of animal communication. And it's the job of the linguistic anthropologist to study all aspects of language and determine its meaning within a given society. And like culture, language is patterned and complex. So there's two characteristics of language, or two basic aspects to the pattern of language: the physical characteristics that make up the words and the meaning of the words. And remember, for the most part, there's no natural connection between the sounds of a word and its meaning. So, for example, if you consider this very simple English sentence, my boyfriend and I are flying to his mother's next week. It's an incredibly simple sentence, but there's a multitude of language needed to understand it. So there's all of the linguistic knowledge, each sound and how it's different. And then each word and its meaning, and the meaning depends on the context. So boyfriend doesn't mean friend who is male. Flying does not mean they have wings, right? How will they get there? My, with reference to boyfriend, does not mean that she owns him in the literal sense. And then we look at tenses. The flight will happen in the future. Are flying is the present tense, but next week is the future. Next week tells you how far in the future. And depending on the day of the conversation, you know a range of when they'll leave. And then there are implicit meanings. His mother's what? Probably her house or her home. Is anyone else going? Probably not. Think about why not. And why his mother's and not his parents' house. So some points about understanding language. Even simple messages such as these require an important amount of linguistic information to understand. Knowledge for speaking and understanding is largely unconscious. The knowledge is intuitive. The meanings of each individual word is arbitrary, and words are a combination of sounds that are symbols for meanings. Language is also creative, meaning you can say and understand things that no one has ever said before or understood. This means that even if you have not heard a sentence, comment, or phrase before, you will likely understand it. And language is made up of discrete and recombinable elements. Individual or discrete sounds make words, and these sounds in different combinations make different words. Language makes it possible to communicate about things, people, and events not immediately present, like mother and next week in the sentence on the previous slide. And this greatly contributes to the power of language and communication. And to imagine the power of language, try to imagine life without it. So let's expand on the importance of language to anthropology. Just as anthropologists consider all cultures to be equally valid, we consider all languages to be equally functional. Some languages have more words for certain areas of experience. Others have to explain the same concept using many more words. Often the group of people who share a common culture also share the same language. And this implies that the language a people speak and the cultural traditions that they share have some relationship to one another. All natural human languages appear to express pretty much everything their speakers need to say. And with enough effort, anything said in one language can be translated into any other language. Thus, all natural human languages are capable of expressing the full range of human thought. So how do we see that? The first is language as a categorizing system. Morphology is the study of how a language divides up experiences into categories. Every language divides up experience differently. So one aspect of language often examined by linguists is how language organizes experience for people. So to look at this, linguists have examined specific cultural domains such as the organization and classification of animals, plants, colors, kinsmen, and so on. So for example, blue in English and Spanish. Blue in English covers two distinct colors in Spanish. So in Spanish, azul means dark blue and celeste means light or sky blue. Blue in English just covers both of those distinct colors. Spanish speakers don't consider azul and celeste to be variants of a single color as English speakers do. They are two distinct colors. So if a Spanish speaker has 3 crayons, one light blue, one yellow, and one red, if you ask for the azul crayon, the Spanish speaker will just be confused and will probably say that he or she has no azul crayon. If you ask an English speaker for the blue crayon, he or she would understand immediately that you mean the light blue one. And this goes beyond an arbitrary naming game. It actually affects how people lump and split their perceptions of the world. It looks at what they consider to be the same and different. What characteristics do they consider more or less fundamental or important? And each system of categorization is an arbitrary cultural construct, which is embedded in the language, and surely that must affect how they think about the world. And then we look at language and thought and the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And this is the claim, and it's still controversial, that the language one speaks affects how one perceives and thinks about the world. Because each language gives you a specific set of morphemes to work with and not others, and certain things you must pay attention to and not others, and certain ideas about how they can be combined and not others. So some thoughts will therefore be obvious or more obvious, easy or natural in some languages and not others. People who speak and think in one language may think differently than people who speak and think in a different language. And recent studies actually suggest that truly bilingual people actually think and respond to questions differently depending on what language they are using. And this idea is more properly called linguistic relativism because, like cultural relativism, which holds that thought and behavior make sense in their cultural context, and they are shaped by the culture they're immersed in, linguistic relativism suggests that thought and behavior may be shaped by the language they are carried out in. And one aspect of this is vocabulary and the categories of words of a language, which define how people split up experiences into categories of things. So again, this claim that a language's particular set of categories or words affects how people think and perceive in the world. A second set of linguistic relativism is based on grammar, or a language's rules for constructing valid sentences. So the claim that a language's grammar affects the speaker's view of the world. And Whorf used an example about time in English and Hopi, and notes that English grammar forces us constantly to specify whether any verb refers to the past, present, or future. So we're forced to constantly think about this three-way division of time every time we speak, and we only optionally indicate whether or not something is hypothetical. The Hopi language requires speakers to specify whether events have come to be, so in the present or past, or have not come to be, hypothetical or in the future. There are no words for time, so they have no way to say in 2 hours, next week, and so on. So they arguably have a different categorization and outlook on time, in which the future is lumped with hypothetical events and the past is lumped with the present, because both have definitely come to pass. And he argues, Whorf does, that this explains why Hopi supposedly take a casual attitude towards finishing projects and tend not to think about deadlines or how long something might take. And this was really hard for me to understand when I started working with the Hopi because I'm always in a hurry. So it does affect the way different groups view the world. The other aspect of language examined by linguists is the evaluation of actual conversation or social uses of speech. So these studies look at turn-taking, pauses, speech strategies and styles, and the variations between speech communities to understand how all of this operates in the conduct of social life. So looking at gender in French and English. French, German, and many other grammars force you to identify the gender of every noun. So le livre is the book, but it's masculine, and la boulangerie is the bakery, but it's feminine. And so in English, you use most nouns without specifying a gender. So the book, the bakery. So presumably, French speakers are forced by their language to think of gender constantly, to see it everywhere, and to consider it relevant to everything. One view is that these grammatical conventions have lost their meaning and are just details of how sentences are formed, but it is at least possible that French affects its speakers' view of gender in the world and gender roles. In many societies, even though they are part of the same speech community, distinctions between male and female speech have been observed. So, for example, in Japan, women's speech is characterized by the more frequent use of the polite form. There's also formality. In French and English, grammar forces the speaker to acknowledge the social status of the person being addressed relative to the one speaking. So tu means you, and it's informal, and the person being spoken to is of similar or lower status, and vous is formal, and the person being spoken to is of higher status. So theoretically, wouldn't this have an effect on how French speakers view the social world? And then we look at focal vocabulary. Most languages divide certain areas of experience into many, many detailed categories. So the Hanuo in the Philippines, with their 92 named types of rice, they can make a very fine distinction about rice that most Americans cannot. But Americans can make many fine distinctions about types of cars, which a Hanuo cannot. The Peruvian can identify and name many types of music: salsa, cumbia, rumba, samba, mambo, merengue, which all sound to many English speakers like Latin music. So focal vocabulary suggests that these things are relevant or important. So this week, I want you to think about language and discuss your ideas.